It started with the soft clink of a flower pot tipping over and ended with sirens screaming through the night, a sound that still claws at my chest every time I close my eyes, because that tiny, innocent accident, my disabled daughter dropping a single ceramic pot on a neighbor's lawn, unleashed a storm of rage that no parent should ever have to witness. I remember standing on the porch frozen, hearing the shatter of clay on concrete, the startled cry of my little girl as she tried to apologize, and then the heavy, furious footsteps pounding toward her. In the fading light of dusk, Karen appeared, her face a twisted mask of outrage, eyes sharp with something far darker than anger. Before I could reach them, words flew like knives, "You people never follow the rules." And a shove sent my world spiraling. There was a scream, my own voice breaking as I ran, and then chaos, neighbors pouring out of their homes, an ambulance cutting through the quiet street, red and blue lights strobing across neatly trimmed hedges while the HOA board members argued in frantic circles instead of helping. Karen stood there stone-faced, arms crossed, her gaze cold and unrepentant, as if a child's life meant less to her than the perfect order of her lawn. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, the air thick with disbelief and the metallic taste of panic, as paramedics worked on the only person who mattered more than my own heartbeat. How could a single slip, a flower pot, for God's sake, turn into a tragedy that shattered a family and exposed the darkest side of suburban living? What kind of neighbor, what kind of human being, lets obsession with rules and property lines override basic humanity? As I clutched my daughter's limp hand and begged her to stay with me, I realized this wasn't just one woman's madness, it was the rotten heart of a system that gave her power and looked away until it was too late. Stay with me, because what happened next will make you question every HOA rule, every neighbor's smile, and the fragile trust we place in the people living just beyond our fences. The morning began with the kind of gentle sunlight that makes the world feel freshly washed, each blade of grass sparkling with dew and every bird call a small celebration of life, and for a few blissful hours it seemed like nothing could tarnish the perfection of our quiet suburban day. My daughter, Emily, was already outside in her wheelchair, carefully gloved hands reaching for the blossoms she loved so dearly, her face lit with the soft determination that made my heart swell with both pride and a bittersweet ache. Born with a congenital condition that limited the strength in her legs, Emily had turned gardening into both therapy and art. She loved the way soil crumbled between her fingers, how color and life could spring from something as simple as a seed. The backyard smelled of damp earth and fresh lavender as she hummed to herself, an old tune she had learned from her grandmother, while I brewed coffee and watched her through the kitchen window. Our neighborhood, lined with tidy hedges and identically painted mailboxes, was still and calm, the kind of planned perfection the HOA bragged about in their newsletters. Yet beneath that outward charm, a tension hummed like a low electric current. From behind the lace curtains of the house across the street, Karen's silhouette flickered every few minutes, a sharp movement, the glint of binoculars, the faint snap of a phone camera. It wasn't new, Karen had always been there in the periphery, an ever-present reminder of the rules and restrictions that came with our address. At first, her intrusions were small, a passive-aggressive note taped to our door about the color of our mailbox, a pointed mention during HOA meetings about those who don't understand community standards, a warning slip citing the height of Emily's wildflowers as non-compliant vegetation. We tried to laugh it off, telling ourselves she was just particular, but the humor thinned each time she appeared at the edge of our yard, hands on hips, eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting prey. That morning she made her first move before breakfast plates were cleared, striding across the street with a clipboard and the stiff posture of someone wearing authority-like armor. "Good morning," she said without warmth, her gaze darting past me to Emily's flower beds, and then she began her ritual of pointing out imagined violations, soil spilling over the border stones, a hose left uncoiled. I answered politely, heart heavy, while Emily continued planting marigolds, her small shoulders stiffening at every clipped remark. After Karen retreated, the day tried to reclaim its peace, but the serenity felt fragile, like a glass ornament balanced on the edge of a shelf. Even the cheerful songs of the sparrows seemed sharper, edged with warning. Emily, ever hopeful, brushed off my worry, chatting about how the marigolds would bring butterflies, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching from behind those curtains, recording every movement. As the hours slipped toward afternoon, I caught glimpses of Karen peeking again, phone in hand, her face pinched with an intensity that bordered on menace. It was as though each petal Emily planted, each gentle laugh that floated across the yard, fed a quiet fury in our neighbor that I couldn't understand. By late day, the air itself felt heavy, thick with an unspoken threat I couldn't quite name, and though the sky was still a brilliant, cloudless blue, the perfect day was already darkening at its edges, setting the stage for a night that would forever break the fragile peace we had tried so hard to build. By late spring, what began as a neighbor's occasional nitpicking hardened into a siege that tightened around our lives with every passing week, each new day bringing another petty provocation that chipped at our sense of safety until even the act of stepping outside felt like walking onto a battlefield, and it was during these tense weeks that Karen's fixation crossed a line no one in our quiet cul-de-sac could have imagined. The first signs of escalation were deceptively small. A string of anonymous complaints slipped into our mailbox citing unsightly plant growth and cluttered yard decor, each one stamped with the HOA's emblem but typed on untraceable paper, the language so cold and formal it felt like it had been designed to strip away any hint of humanity. At HOA meetings, where neighbors once chatted about block parties and school fundraisers, conversations now bent sharply whenever I walked in, whispers curling through the air like smoke, and I could feel the judgment settle on my shoulders as Karen, perched at the head of the table with her ever-present clipboard, smiled with the tight-lipped satisfaction of someone who had already written the verdict. Emily, my gentle, bright-souled girl, continued tending to her marigolds and violets, her soft laughter floating like music through the tension, but I began to see her innocence as a fragile shield. She had no idea that the very neighbors waving politely from their driveways might have signed the latest complaint, or that Karen's sugary "good evening" masked a gathering storm. Each week brought something new, a note demanding we repaint our fence to a shade of beige approved by the board, a warning about a supposed water leak that didn't exist, a late-night phone call with no voice on the other end but the sound of steady breathing. When I confronted Karen about the false reports, her eyes gleamed with an unsettling calm, and she leaned close enough that I felt the cold edge of her words. "Accidents happen when rules are ignored," she murmured, each syllable sharp as broken glass. The HOA board, far from reining her in, seemed to embolden her. When I reported the harassment, they responded with vague platitudes about community harmony and personal responsibility, then pivoted to questioning whether Emily's raised garden beds met setback requirements. I started keeping a notebook of incidents, times, dates, the color of envelopes, half for the police I kept hoping I'd never need, half to reassure myself I wasn't imagining things. Yet Karen's campaign only deepened. One morning we woke to find our trash bins tipped and their contents scattered neatly, as though someone had catalogued each item. Another night, a trail of potting soil led from our driveway to the HOA clubhouse like a breadcrumb path. Through it all, Emily remained a bright flame of kindness, offering cookies to neighbors who barely nodded back, humming while she watered her flowers, unaware of the dark scrutiny fixed upon her every movement. I tried to mask my fear with calm smiles, but inside, anxiety knotted tighter each day. I checked the locks twice, left porch lights blazing, and kept the curtains drawn, yet I sensed Karen watching from behind her blinds, the faint glow of her phone like a predator's eye in the dark. It wasn't only the obvious acts, the vandalism, the letters, but the atmosphere she created, a constant, suffocating pressure that seeped into every corner of our lives until even the sound of a twig snapping in the yard jolted me awake. Friends urged me to move, but the mortgage, Emily's special therapy programs nearby, and the naive hope that reason might prevail kept us rooted. Looking back, I realized the neighborhood itself seemed complicit, lulled by Karen's charm when she wanted to wield it and by the comfort of rules that let them look away. Every time I left an HOA meeting, my pleas dismissed with empty smiles, I felt a chill of inevitability, as if the ground beneath our carefully tended lawn was shifting, carrying us toward a confrontation no one else cared to stop. What none of us grasped was that the tipping point was already here, silent but unstoppable, waiting for the smallest spark, something as simple and innocent as a flower pot slipping from a child's grasp, to ignite the violence Karen had been nursing in the shadows all along. The night that would end our world began as quietly as any other, the soft hum of evening settling over the neighborhood like a comforting quilt, and for a brief, deceptive stretch it felt almost peaceful, until a single, unremarkable sound cracked that calm and set in motion a chain of violence I still relive with every heartbeat. Emily had gone out just after dusk to give her marigolds one last drink of water before bedtime, her wheelchair gliding softly along the garden path while I tidied the kitchen and listened to the faint splash of her watering can and the occasional chirp of crickets. The air smelled of damp earth and late summer roses, sweet and grounding, but beneath it was a hint of something sharper, like metal, a note of unease I couldn't name at the time. At 8:42 p.m., I heard it, the soft thud of ceramic striking concrete, followed by the brittle crack of a pot shattering. It was so small a sound, like a teacup breaking, but it sliced through the evening like an alarm. I dropped the dish towel and ran for the door, heart quickening, just as Emily's startled voice called out, "Mom, I'm so sorry." It slipped. The words barely left her lips when another sound cut in, the sharp, staccato slam of a front door across the street and the fast, heavy pound of footsteps on pavement. Karen emerged from the shadows with a speed and force that made the air feel charged, her eyes locked on Emily with a fury that didn't belong to something as simple as a broken flower pot. "What have you done?" she shrieked, her voice raw and jagged, carrying across the quiet cul-de-sac and making the neighbors' porch lights flick on one by one. "Do you think you can ruin my property and get away with it?" I sprinted across the lawn, calling out for her to stop, but she was already at the edge of our driveway, her fists clenched so tight the knuckles gleamed white in the glow of the street lamp. The smell of soil and crushed marigold petals drifted up from the pavement, strangely vivid against the acrid scent of Karen's rage. Emily's hands trembled as she tried to explain, her small voice breaking, but Karen's anger only seemed to swell, fed by weeks of resentment and the imagined power of HOA bylaws. "This is destruction of property," she shouted, her words a torrent that drowned out Emily's apology. "People like you think the rules don't apply." Her body language shifted in a way that made my stomach drop, shoulders squared, one foot edging forward, like a predator closing in. I reached for Emily, but Karen lunged first, shoving past me with a sudden, violent force that sent me stumbling. I heard the metallic clatter of Emily's wheelchair brake releasing, the scrape of wheels against concrete, and then a sickening thud that seemed to echo forever. For a heartbeat, the world narrowed to fragments, the bright scatter of soil against the driveway, the bitter tang of adrenaline flooding my mouth, the sound of Emily's frightened cry cut short. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and dialed 911, the operator's calm voice barely audible over the rising chaos, neighbors yelling, dogs barking, a distant siren that seemed impossibly far away. "Please," I begged, my voice breaking as I tried to give our address, "she's hurt, my daughter's hurt, please hurry." Around us, porch lights flared and curtains twitched, but for too many seconds no one moved, the bystander shock of a peaceful street shattered in an instant. Karen stood over Emily with a wild, cold fury that frightened me more than any weapon could have, her breathing ragged as if she'd crossed a line she couldn't retreat from. When a neighbor finally stepped forward, shouting for her to stop, she spun on him with eyes that glinted like glass shards, her words a venomous snarl about community standards and property rights, as though those phrases could explain what she'd just done. In the distance, the wail of approaching sirens grew sharper, slicing through the heavy night air, and still Karen didn't back away until the first blue strobe of a patrol car's lights washed over her face, revealing a grim, defiant calm where there should have been horror or remorse. The paramedics rushed in, their voices clipped and urgent, kneeling beside Emily as I dropped to my knees, clutching her hand, whispering that help was here and that everything would be okay even as I felt the terrible stillness in her small fingers. The world around me blurred into motion, police officers questioning neighbors, camera flashes from phones, a radio crackling with dispatch updates, while my focus tunneled to Emily's pale face and the soft hiss of oxygen the medics fed her, every second stretching unbearably. I remember the cold grit of driveway gravel under my knees, the faint scent of gasoline from the idling ambulance, and the distant murmur of a crowd gathering, but all of it was muffled beneath the roar of my own heart and the single thought that hammered through me: this cannot be how her life ends, not here, not over a flower pot. When the medics finally lifted her onto the stretcher, I held her hand until they closed the ambulance doors, my pleas to ride with her met with gentle, urgent assurances that they needed space to work. As the vehicle pulled away, lights flashing against the darkened houses, I turned back to see Karen standing perfectly still at the edge of her lawn, arms crossed as if she were merely observing a neighborhood dispute and not the devastation she'd unleashed. The neighbors who had once waved politely now stood in uneasy silence, their faces pale with the realization that they had watched this tension build and done nothing. Even as the sirens faded into the distance and the officers led Karen toward a squad car, her head held high and unrepentant, I knew that the night's true damage could never be measured in broken pottery or legal charges. It was written in the last terrified look my daughter gave me, a look that begged for protection I couldn't give in time, and that will haunt me for every breath I take. The race for justice began the instant the ambulance doors slammed shut and its sirens wailed into the night, carrying my barely breathing daughter toward the trauma center while I followed in my own car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached and my vision blurred with tears that refused to fall because shock had locked every emotion inside a cage of numb terror, and those minutes on the road felt like an endless tunnel with no light at the end. At the emergency room, the harsh fluorescent lights were too bright, the antiseptic smell too sharp, and the sight of doctors and nurses rushing Emily past me on a stretcher was so surreal that for a moment I thought I might be watching someone else's nightmare. I answered their rapid-fire questions about medications and allergies with a mechanical precision I didn't know I had, clinging to the hope that quick medical action could undo the violence of one neighbor's rage. But as the double doors swung closed behind her, a leaden stillness settled over me, pierced only by the beep of distant monitors and the low murmur of staff. Hours blurred together in that waiting room, each tick of the clock a small eternity, until a soft-voiced surgeon emerged, eyes clouded with the weight of his words, and told me they had done everything possible but that the injuries were catastrophic. My world folded inward in that moment, the sounds of the hospital fading into a single, endless echo of disbelief. Even as grief threatened to swallow me, a quiet resolve took root: someone had to answer for this, and I would not let the system bury my daughter's death under bureaucracy or HOA doublespeak. Outside the ER, a pair of uniformed officers approached with the practiced solemnity of men who have delivered bad news before. They explained that Karen had been detained but not yet charged, that she was invoking her rights and offering a version of events that made my heart pound with fresh outrage. She claimed self-defense and property damage, twisting a child's innocent accident into an act of malice. They asked me to recount every detail of the evening, my voice cracking as I relived each second, from the sound of the flower pot breaking to Karen's furious charge. I could see doubt flicker across one officer's face, not doubt of my story, but of the fight ahead, the legal tangle waiting beyond these first statements. By morning, HOA board members were already working to shield Karen, issuing carefully worded emails to the neighborhood about an unfortunate incident and urging residents not to speculate while investigations are ongoing, as if neutral language could erase the fact that a child lay dead because of their complacency. But while the HOA tried to smother the fire, the outside world ignited. A neighbor's cell phone footage of the aftermath, Karen's icy stillness as paramedics fought for Emily's life, spread across social media within hours. By the next day, #JusticeForEmily was trending nationwide, with journalists camped at the subdivision entrance and satellite trucks lining the street where children once rode bikes. Strangers from across the country sent messages of support and outrage, their collective voice demanding answers even as local officials urged patience. Reporters knocked on doors, coaxing stories from witnesses who had been too frightened to speak the night before, and each account painted the same picture: months of harassment, HOA-backed intimidation, and a neighbor whose obsession with rules had crossed into dangerous territory. Still, the legal system moved with a frustrating sluggishness that felt like betrayal. Days stretched into weeks as investigators gathered statements, subpoenaed HOA emails, and sifted through the tangle of local ordinances and property laws Karen's lawyer immediately weaponized. Her defense leaned hard on the idea of property rights and imminent threat, pointing to the broken flower pot as supposed evidence of malicious intent. The HOA, terrified of liability, stalled at every turn, denying requests for meeting minutes and internal correspondence until court orders forced their hand. When the first batch of documents finally emerged, they revealed a pattern of targeted complaints and secret board discussions about disciplinary action against our family, proof of a vendetta that stretched back months and gave prosecutors ammunition to argue that this was not a sudden outburst but a premeditated campaign. Even with mounting evidence, witnesses hesitated. Some feared retaliation from the HOA, worried that siding with me would mean endless fines or subtle acts of revenge like the ones we had endured. I spent long nights on the phone reassuring nervous neighbors, urging them to tell the truth for Emily's sake, while community activists and pro bono lawyers helped me navigate restraining orders and victim advocacy filings. Each small victory, the release of an incriminating email, the quiet confession of a neighbor who had heard Karen's threats, felt hard-won against a system designed to grind down the grieving and protect the powerful. Through it all, the media attention proved to be both weapon and shield. National outlets aired interviews with child psychologists and legal experts who condemned the HOA culture that had allowed Karen's obsession to flourish, while local talk radio buzzed with calls for reform. The pressure forced county prosecutors to prioritize the case and pushed state legislators to draft proposals tightening oversight of homeowner associations. Strangers sent letters to the courthouse and flooded the district attorney's office with calls demanding an indictment. The weight of public outrage became impossible to ignore. Yet the most difficult battle remained the courtroom itself, where Karen's defense team sought every delay, filing motion after motion to suppress evidence and discredit witnesses. Each postponed hearing felt like an insult to Emily's memory, but I refused to let despair win. Supported by a growing network of advocates and buoyed by the relentless compassion of people who had never met my daughter, I appeared at every proceeding, clutching the same photo of Emily in her garden, a silent reminder of the life that should have been. I learned to speak the cold language of legal briefs and evidentiary rules, to push back against the slow churn of justice with the fire of a mother who will not be silenced. What began as a single night of horror became a months-long test of endurance, a race where every mile was lined with obstacles, HOA politics protecting their own, neighbors too frightened to testify, procedural delays that threatened to dull public outrage. But I kept running, because each step forward, every new witness, every damning document, every national headline, meant we were closer to ensuring that Karen faced the full weight of the law. Even in the darkest hours, when grief sat heavy on my chest and the courthouse hallways felt endless, I carried Emily's spirit with me, her love of flowers and quiet courage blooming into a resolve that no rule, no threat, no carefully worded HOA statement could ever uproot. This was more than a case, it was a reckoning with a culture that prizes property over people, and I swore that my daughter's name would be remembered not only in sorrow but in the laws and hearts she would change forever. The courthouse brimmed with a charged silence on the morning of the trial, every polished wooden bench packed with reporters, neighbors, and activists who had followed the case since that terrible night, their faces a mixture of tense anticipation and quiet fury as they watched Karen walk in wearing a charcoal gray suit and the same icy composure she had worn when police first led her away from the scene of Emily's death. And from the moment the bailiff called the courtroom to order, it was clear that this would be more than a simple hearing, it was a reckoning years in the making. The prosecution opened with a steady, measured voice that carried the weight of months of investigation, a timeline of harassment laid out like a map, photographs of Emily's shattered flower pot projected in heart-wrenching clarity, and recordings of frantic 911 calls that filled the room with the echo of a mother's terror. Each piece of evidence built a scaffolding of motive and premeditation, a narrative of an HOA leader who had allowed obsession to rot into lethal action. The defense countered with cold precision, their lead attorney a tall man in a sharp navy suit whose every word dripped with calculated doubt. He painted Karen as a model homeowner, protecting community standards, a woman who had been startled by a sudden and aggressive disturbance, and acted only in fear for her safety. But his arguments trembled under the weight of what came next. One by one, neighbors took the stand, their voices hesitant at first but growing stronger as they recounted months of intimidation, late-night phone calls with silent breathing, photographs of Emily's garden taken without permission, and HOA meetings where Karen used words like discipline and escalation when discussing our family. The air in the courtroom seemed to tighten with each testimony, until a collective shiver passed through the gallery when the prosecution unveiled the most damning evidence of all: internal HOA emails obtained by subpoena, displayed on a large screen for every juror and spectator to read. The messages were chilling in their casual malice. Karen complaining that the disabled child's mess is lowering our property values, and boasting that, if the board won't act, I will. Gasps rippled through the room as each line appeared, the cold bureaucratic phrasing now unmistakable as threats. I sat rigid, Emily's photograph clasped in my hands, every word both a knife and a vindication, proof that my daughter's life had been stalked long before that night. The defense tried to pivot, objecting that the emails were taken out of context, but the judge's gavel came down firmly, allowing them into evidence as a window into Karen's intent. The prosecution's closing argument wove those threads into a powerful tapestry of accountability, urging the jury to reject the notion that neighborhood rules could excuse violence and reminding them of the bright, gentle life snuffed out over a broken pot of flowers. When it was the defense's turn, their strategy felt increasingly hollow, a brittle insistence on self-defense that cracked under the weight of eyewitness accounts and written proof of a vendetta. Hours later, when the jury retired to deliberate, the room exhaled at last, though tension still hummed like a live wire. I sat in that limbo with every nerve stretched to breaking, replaying Emily's laughter, her love of marigolds, the way she had looked back at me in those final seconds. After what felt like an eternity but was barely 3 hours, the jurors filed back in, faces solemn yet resolute, and the foreperson stood to deliver the verdict that would decide whether all of this pain had meaning. Guilty, the word rang out, first on the charge of second-degree murder, then on aggravated assault, and finally on harassment, each syllable a release of breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for months. The room erupted in a mix of relieved sobs and quiet applause, the judge's gavel barely containing the swell of emotion, and I felt tears finally break free as the reality settled in: justice, imperfect but undeniable, had been served. Karen's mask of calm cracked for the first time as the bailiff stepped forward, her eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape that no longer existed, and for a fleeting second I wondered if she finally understood the human cost of the obsession she had nurtured. As the sentence was read, decades in state prison with no chance of early release, the collective weight of months of fear and grief began to lift, replaced by something sturdier than triumph, a solemn acknowledgement that Emily's life had changed not only my world but the law itself. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed and microphones jostled, but the only sound I truly heard was the quiet strength of strangers thanking me for refusing to give up, their voices promising that our fight would echo in every community where power and property once seemed to matter more than people. In the quiet weeks following the verdict, grief settled over our home like a heavy mist that refused to lift, and though the courtroom victory had brought a measure of justice, it could never fill the vast, aching space where Emily's laughter once lived. Every corner of the house still carried her presence, the faint floral scent of her marigolds lingering on the porch, the half-finished sketch of a butterfly garden she had planned taped to the refrigerator, and each reminder was both a comfort and a wound. At first, the silence of our neighborhood felt unbearable, but slowly, something unexpected began to stir beneath the sorrow, a current of collective reckoning and resolve that would transform not just our street but the entire community. Neighbors who had once watched from behind curtains stepped forward, some in tears, admitting their fear and regret for not speaking out sooner. Others arrived with casseroles and open arms, determined to show that our family was no longer alone. The HOA, long a fortress of rigid rules and cold bureaucracy, found itself under relentless pressure as residents demanded sweeping reforms or outright dissolution. Heated town hall meetings replaced the old perfunctory gatherings, with voices rising not in gossip but in calls for accountability and compassion. Petitions circulated to strip the HOA board of unchecked power, and within months, a special vote forced the resignation of key members who had ignored Karen's escalating harassment. Where there had once been silence and polite avoidance, there was now dialogue about mental health support, conflict mediation, and the need to protect vulnerable families rather than punish them. Local lawmakers, galvanized by the case's national attention, introduced bills requiring transparency in HOA operations and establishing clearer protections against harassment and abuse of authority. Even as structural changes unfolded, the deeper healing came in moments of shared humanity, a candlelight vigil where neighbors and strangers alike planted marigolds in Emily's memory, a new community garden dedicated to children of all abilities, where laughter and growth replaced the fear that had once poisoned our yards, support groups for parents of disabled children offering resources on safety and advocacy. Through these collective acts, our tragedy became a seed of change, sprouting connections and safeguards that will outlive us all. Personally, I found solace in telling Emily's story, not just in interviews or at rallies, but in quiet conversations with other parents who confided their own brushes with neighborly cruelty and systemic indifference. Each time I spoke her name, I felt a small victory over the silence that Karen had tried to enforce. The pain of loss never truly softened, but it gained purpose, becoming a force that propelled reforms and saved others from similar fates. Looking back, I see how a single act of senseless violence exposed something larger and more insidious: the danger of communities that prize order over empathy, and of rules wielded like weapons instead of used to build understanding. What began as a story of loss has become a movement rooted in love and responsibility. Our neighbors, once bound only by proximity, are now united by a hard-earned awareness that safety and kindness must be everyone's work. Standing in the garden we built together, surrounded by blooms Emily once dreamed of planting, I know her life continues to shape the world, each petal a reminder that while one person's obsession caused unspeakable harm, a community's courage can create lasting good. And as I kneel in the soil she loved, I whisper a promise into the wind that carries her memory: we will keep watching out for each other, we will keep fighting for compassion over control, and we will never again let silence give power to cruelty.